Today we're going to learn how you can make this off-grid prepper yeast that you're seeing here from wild yeast that you cultivate yourself. And we're also going to make this loaf of bread from that same yeast that you're going to be learning how to make, all totally off-grid, so you can still make bread for when the dark times come. So let's jump right into it. Okay, here's my story of how I am trying to be as self-reliant as possible. And I'm also going to try to tackle a few things that I just don't think that most preppers think about. Especially since I've seen many preppers talk about being able to make bread by cultivating wild yeast after SHTF, but I haven't seen many of them actually doing it. But as I'm telling you what many preppers mess up about completely off-grid bread making, let's get started on actually making your own off-grid wild yeast. Okay, the first things that you're going to need are, at minimum, a quart-sized jar, a measuring cup, and this 1/4 cup measuring cup worked perfect for me, and some filtered water because I hear that regular tap water contains chlorine and other chemicals that could kill the wild yeast that you're trying to cultivate. And last but not least, some flour. Now I wanted to do this as close to off-grid as possible, so I'm using this unground whole wheat berries from my stockpile of long-term storage wheat from the Church of the Latter-day Saints Family Home Storage Center. And I've bought quite a bit of this wheat from the LDS because it comes vacuum packed in number 10 cans and will last around 30 years. And it's my understanding that unground or unmilled wheat will store for 3 times longer than flour. So this is something that you can buy and put into a closet and forget about it. Now if you're interested in buying this wheat from the LDS Family Home Storage, I'll put a link down in the description box below that will allow you to see if a LDS Storage Center warehouse is near where you live. And I have personally, as a non-LDS person, have walked in and purchased quite a bit of different long-term storage food from there. Now there was also another reason why I wanted to use some of this LDS wheat that I've got stored in my preps, and that's because my first attempt at this failed miserably. And I thought it was because the vacuum packing may have killed off the yeast on the wheat that you're actually trying to cultivate when you do this. And that's because, from my understanding, and contrary to popular belief, but when you do this, you're not actually capturing yeast from the air. You're actually cultivating the yeast that's already naturally on the wheat. And what you're making here is actually called a yeast starter, which means that once you successfully make this, that you just use some of this in your bread instead of the granulated store-bought yeast that probably won't be available after SHTF. So again, when my first attempt failed, I was really afraid that the vacuum pack of the stored wheat may have killed off the yeast, which would be a huge deal for us preppers who plan to make bread after SHTF using wheat that's been packaged for long-term storage. But you'll see in this video that I was successful at cultivating the yeast and exactly how I did it. So again, to keep this as close to how one may have to do it after SHTF, I first milled the wheat down into flour using my Wonder Mill Junior Grain Deluxe Mill. And it will be with this flour that I use to make the yeast with. Now my personal opinion is that this Wonder Mill Junior is the best bang for your buck. While there's cheaper ones out there, I think this one will last and will even be able to be handed down to your grandchildren. And if you're interested in purchasing one of these, I'll also put a link to where you can get one down below in the description box. And I'm not trying to sell you anything. If you want to buy it, then buy it, and if you don't, you don't. And now since I've milled down a couple of cups of flour, now I'm just simply going to mix together the flour and the water into a mixture that's equal to weight. Now I've seen other videos where the person in the video is telling you that you need digital scales and all that just to ensure that you get the quantities correct. But that's just making it too difficult. So I'm just going to do 3 scoops of flour and 2 scoops of unfiltered water, and that seems to be close enough in weight and works fine for me. And also, while I'm using a 1/4 cup measuring cup, you can obviously use a larger one, but I'm going to caution you against using a smaller measuring cup because that is what I did on my first attempt, and it failed miserably. And I suspect that it failed because I just didn't have enough flour in there for the yeast to really take hold. Well, at least that's my theory. And now I'm just going to mix it enough to make sure that it's completely mixed. And your end result should be the same consistency as a really thick pancake batter. And now what I'm going to do is put a breathable lid on it. And while I'm using a piece of paper towel just for convenience, you could use some cheesecloth or part of a thin rag or whatever. You just want to use something that will allow the air to flow in while keeping the bugs out. And now I'm just going to leave it on the countertop for the yeast that's naturally inside there to start cultivating. I'm not going to refrigerate it or stir it or anything else. I'm just going to let it sit on the counter for approximately 24 hours before touching it again tomorrow. Okay, now it's just about 24 hours later and on day 2. And now I'm just going to get some of the flour that I had milled down the night before. And all I'm going to do is remove the breathable top and just add 3 more scoops of the flour. And 2 more scoops of the unfiltered water. And then I'm going to mix it again thoroughly until it's completely mixed. And then put the lid back on. And just simply keep it on the counter where we'll keep repeating this until we successfully cultivate the wild yeast. Okay, it is day number 3 and I am very excited by how much this has risen overnight. That is definite signs that the yeast has activated because you can see how much this has risen. I don't know if you can bring this up on the camera or not, but right here is where it says wide mouth on the jar. And yesterday when I mixed this stuff, it was probably about right here. So we can see from about right where my marker is now up to here is how much it's risen overnight. I'm very excited about this because the yeast activated on the 3rd day, while in the past it's usually taken closer to 5 to 7 days before it activates. So hopefully this is picking it up, but you can see all the air bubbles inside of here. Again, that's just the yeast that's really taking place. I can't tell if this is on the way up, if it's still foaming or not foaming, but if it's still going up or if it's going down. It's hard to tell. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark this right here, and then I'm going to go to church, and then when I come back from church we'll recheck it and see if it's going up or if it's going down. Okay, it is now about 3.5 hours later. We just got home from church a little bit ago. You can see where it is higher than the line. Before we went to church this morning, I drew a line there. Now it's higher than that. I don't know if it's on the way back down or if it's still actually on the way up. By the looks of the residue here, I think it's went up and it's on its way back down. And hopefully the camera is really picking up all the little small air bubbles that's inside of the bottle. And that's just really how you know that the yeast is really active inside of there. Okay, so today is day number 3, and instead of just purely adding extra to this one, I'm actually going to knock it down because this has a lot of air bubbles in there. So I'm actually going to knock it down first. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove 3 scoops from this, because again, if I just continue to add new in here, this will end up just overflowing as it rises. So I'm going to remove about 3 scoops. Okay, with this jar that I added this 3 new scoops to, or these 3 old scoops to, if I wanted to, I could add 3 scoops of flour to this and start a second one of these. So now, since I've removed about half of this, now I'm going to add 3 more new of these. As the yeast activates, as it causes the flour and the water mixture to become filled with air bubbles, the mixture will rise and fall. So this is natural and is something that you want to see. And now I'm just going to mix it up thoroughly, just like the other times, and then keep it out on the countertop until the next day. And if your first attempt at making yeast fails, just like mine did, don't get discouraged and just try it again. Okay, so now each new day, over the next several days, it's going to be exactly the same. I'll remove 3 scoops out of the jar and then add 3 new scoops of flour and 2 scoops of unfiltered water. Because each time that you add new flour, what you're doing is giving the wild yeast that you've already activated something to feed on, something to let it grow more and more with. And I have found that each time that I add new flour and water, that several hours later that I'll see that it's doing the slow rising up and then slowly falling back down again action, which just confirms that I'm being successful at making my own wild yeast that I can make off-grid bread with. And you'll also find that after several days of repeating this, but as your wild yeast is getting more and more mature, the more of a sourdough smell that you'll start smelling also. And if you find that you have a little excess water that's kind of floating on top of the mixture, it's not a big deal, and that's actually called hooch, and you can just pour it off. Now during SHTF, and if you're going to be making bread every day, this mixture will never need to be refrigerated, nor will you need to discard all of the old flour mixture. When you make bread, you'll just simply put what you would have discarded into your bread dough instead, and then add the new flour and water to keep your yeast starter going. And if you're serious about learning how to make truly off-grid bread, and you're curious about how much homemade yeast you would use instead of the store-bought yeast, then stay tuned, because shortly I'm going to show you how to use this wild yeast in your bread dough to actually make a loaf of off-grid bread. Now, if you're not going to be making bread daily where you would be using up the yeast starter, then after several days and after your yeast starter is firmly established, then you can put it into your refrigerator. And what this does is basically slows it down. And then once a week you can take out about half of it and then mix in new flour and water in it to keep it alive and going. And also, while this is a yeast starter, technically it's a sourdough yeast starter. And the more that you age it, the stronger of a sourdough taste that you're going to have. And the less that it's aged, then the less of that sourdough taste. Now we're going to see how to actually make a loaf of bread. And the only way that you can get more off-grid than this would be if you grew the wheat yourself. But real quick, a link to an anonymous poll should be appearing in the upper right hand corner of the screen about now. And hey, please go take that poll and let's see where we, as a prepper community, how we plan to purify water after SHTF. Do you have a water purifier like the Berkey? Or do you plan to boil all of your water, or distill it, or use pull shock and a water purifier? So go ahead and take that poll and let's see what other preppers are planning to do. And I will be selecting the option that says pull shock and water purifier. Now to make this bread, because again we're wanting to keep it as off-grid as possible, I milled down a little over 3 cups of wheat into flour. 3 cups of it will be for the bread dough, and the extra will be to sprinkle on the countertop when I form that dough. So first I add the 3 cups of flour, and then I add the 1.5 teaspoons of salt, which I have plenty of in my food stockpiles. And then I'm going to add about 2 scoops, or about 1/2 cup of the homemade yeast, since I'm using 3 cups of flour. And then I'm going to add about 1.5 cups of water. Now what I'm going to do is stir it up really well so that all of the ingredients are thoroughly mixed together. And you should notice that the bread dough is just below that black marker line that I've drawn on the bowl. Now it's my understanding that this homemade yeast just doesn't work as fast as store-bought yeast. So I'm just going to cover it and let it sit in a cabinet for about 12 to 18 hours to let the yeast have plenty of time to do its work. And now it's the next day, and you should notice that the yeast that we made has caused the bread dough to rise about double in size, and this is exactly what we want. And what I'm going to do now is knock it down, and then I'm going to sprinkle a little of the extra flour onto my workspace and then form it into the loaf. And I'm not going to knead it too much, I'm just going to work it just a little bit and then form it into a loaf. And now I've sprinkled a little extra flour into this bread pan to help keep the dough from sticking to it, and then I'm going to let the dough re-rise in the bread pan for just about 2 hours before I cook it. And just for fanciness, I'm going to make some little slices on the surface of the bread so that it has that artesian bread look to it when it's finished cooking. And in the spirit of keeping this totally off-grid, I preheated my Dutch oven in my fire pit for about a half hour so that it's good and hot and will cook the bread evenly. And now I'm just going to move the Dutch oven where it's close, but not directly on top of the hot coals. And then I'm going to put the bread into the Dutch oven, and then put the lid on, and then put some hot coals on the lid for even more heat. And then I'm going to let it bake for about 45 minutes. And you typically know when bread is done when it has that nice gold brown look to it. And then also when it has a really hollow sound when you thump it with your finger. Now you can probably notice that it's gotten dark outside now, and I've also let the bread get just a little too done, but it's not the end of the world. But now I'm going to remove it from the bread pan, and I'm going to let it sit for an hour before I slice into it. Now while cooking this, it had my whole backyard smelling like a bread factory. So this would just be something to consider if you were trying to do stealth cooking so that you wouldn't alert any hungry neighbors. But now since it's been about an hour, let's see what it looks and tastes like. And all I can say is, wow. If you like the taste of sourdough bread, then you're going to love this. The sourdough flavor just really explodes when you take a bite out of it. This really tastes awesome. I think it tastes better than bread that you get at a fancy restaurant. And luckily, while the crust did get just a little too well done, luckily the inside is very soft and tastes great. And now I want some of you more experienced off-grid bread makers to comment below and help educate both me and the rest of the prepping community. And with keeping this as simple and as off-grid as possible, what would you do differently with making bread? And while I know that you can make yeast by soaking unwashed fruit or fruit peels in water, but after SHTF that may only work during the warmer months when a person can actually grow fruit, if a person has fruit at all. So share with us, how do you plan to make yeast if you don't have access to fruit? And hey, I'd also like for you to comment below if you plan to try this out yourself or if you've already made yeast yourself. And after SHTF, if all you have is beans and rice and a few other items that you've got stored for long term, then you will quickly grow tired and bored of those same foods. So being able to easily grow something that will add flavor and variety and also add extra nutrients will be something that any serious prepper will want to know how to do. So to see just how easily you can grow herbs which will add flavor to your food and also give you those much needed extra nutrients, even if you live in an apartment, then click on the link that should be appearing in the upper right hand corner of the screen just about now. And after SHTF, eventually your stockpile foods will run out and you won't be able to buy seeds at the store, and you also won't be able to buy insecticides to keep the bugs from eating up everything that you're trying to grow for food to eat. So to see a video that shows how you can have a life-saving, successful garden after SHTF, then click on the video that should be appearing on the right side of the screen just about now. Anyways folks, if you made it this far, hey, thank you very much for watching, and I pray that you have a good night.